The People Who Mattered project will be a slightly different take on the regular research paper that looks at the history and development of a field. In this case, we'll be telling the story of our chosen field of interest through profiling 2 to 3 important people who had some amount of influence on the field's development. Before getting any further, I need to differentiate 2 important terms to make sure that we understand why one of those has a much narrower focus than the other one does. Remember, we're talking about a profile here, and that's profile versus biography. A profile is a piece of writing about a person centrally focused on one aspect of that person's life. Right, so think of it like this. We're taking that single aspect of that person's life, and it's that particular aspect that's guiding our choice of any additional details we include. We're only choosing to include those things that will help to understand the central focus or aspect we've already chosen. Profiles discuss the subject's present life as well as relevant details from his or her past, but again, we're exploring that one central focus. All of this is in stark contrast to the biography, which really has as its main purpose simply covering the entirety of one's life, or some significant part of it, right? So you've got the profile over here that has us focusing on being able to explain one particular focus versus the biography here, which has as its main goal thoroughness or completeness of coverage. To continue on a little bit further, there are 2 additional terms that, again, I want to define through differentiation. Those terms are field versus discipline. One's field refers to the total sphere of activity encompassing all those who are working or studying within a particular discipline, where discipline itself is simply a specific branch of knowledge. So to put the 2 of these words together in terms of my own specialty, my discipline is English. That's the subject that I've been studying for all of my professional life. It's the subject that I studied for 6 years while I was in college and graduate school. Whereas my field is college level teaching and pedagogy, right? So my field consists of the activities or the teaching that I do within the broad category that is the discipline that I've been studying. Now, when we talk about prominent figures, we're talking about those figures without whom the field that we've chosen to study would either not exist at all or would be far less developed or have taken a radically different shape. Some examples of such a field and figure would include Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. It would include Henry Ford and assembly line manufacturing. You've probably heard this, but Henry Ford was famously able to begin selling his automobiles specifically because of the amount of money saved by assembly line manufacturing. If you hear the name Elon Musk, perhaps the first thing you think of is the Tesla brand of automobiles, but actually Elon Musk's more historically well-known contribution, I think, will be going forward his work on battery technology. We have Marie Curie in radiology, and last, Nellie Bly, who was not just the first of the real investigative journalists the way that we know it, but of course a woman, which is a really important thing that way too. When we talk about choosing relevant details, we've got to remember, again, that central difference between that which is a profile and that which is a biography. Since this is a profile and not a biography, we're not interested in addressing the entirety of a figure's lifetime. Instead, only the parts of it that help to explain or otherwise contextualize the figure's addition to the field that we're looking at. Information you knew about the field or the figure before you did your research should be regarded as general knowledge, right? So I want to emphasize that. We've got to have a very good sensitivity for those things that we already knew about, because, of course, if that's general knowledge for us, the likelihood is good that it's general knowledge for a large portion of the people that might be reading our profiles, and we don't want to have to shove too much of that down their throats. No one wants to have to read or listen to somebody talking about what they already knew for any period of time. It's boring and eventually a little bit insulting too. Now, general knowledge information is suitable for a lead-in to what might be a more important, less widely known piece of information about the figure's contributions to the field. Again, though, I do want to emphasize general knowledge really can't be the focus of any substantial amount of space, be it a paragraph or even a whole section, right? We really have to have something new and fresh and unexpected, something we found through research, if we're going to be able to support that amount of development. So, the more generally well known and understood piece of information is, the less your reader wants to have to read about it. Think of it like this: the reader should never, ever have to wonder why they're being told what you're telling them. And lastly, I'd like you to think a little bit about what I call the 30-second clock. This is not my idea. This comes from a writer named William Zinsser, who thought far more about this than I have. But I'm going to take it from him because it's useful for our discussion right now. The 30-second clock has to do with the fact that when your reader has to stop and backtrack or otherwise just look around the writing to try to figure out what's going on, there is not an unlimited amount of time that reader is going to keep doing that. In fact, it's about 30 seconds. And that's collectively. So maybe a reader spends 10 seconds doing that the first time. There's only 20 more seconds that reader's going to keep doing it until eventually the reader is so frustrated and so bored they just stop, and that's the last thing we want. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some building block outlining and planning. First, think of what the introduction needs to do here. It needs to be a discussion of the current state, shape, and direction of the field you're in. Now, if you wanted to go back to your Where the Known Meets the Unknown paper, you've actually sort of done this already. The establishment of the field and where it is and what it's doing was a necessary part of the first part of that paper. So if you wanted to refer to that as a way of giving yourself a sort of a boost or a direction to begin this draft, it's probably not a bad idea. I would recommend going on from that and doing some additional general knowledge research. Wikipedia this. It's not going to take too much work, but start from that basis at least and use that as a way of figuring out exactly how to go about even what might just be that basic research into where the field's going right now. After that, end with a thesis statement, right? Again, we're talking about the introduction, and the introduction's main job is to have a thesis statement. So end with a thesis statement that somehow unifies the influence of the figures you'll discuss in the body paragraphs, right? So it's a necessary thing to start by saying, hey, these people who are coming up, they're important influences. But if you can go a step beyond that and find a way to talk about how all of them have been an important influence in one particular way, that's even better. There is no opportunity as great as that of the introduction and thesis statement to give your reader the tools they need to be able to get through the writing and know not only what they're reading, but what to expect to find next. From there, as you start thinking about your figures, I want you to consider audience reactions, audience awareness, and audience expectations, right? If your audience is seeing what you're doing here, that is that you are telling the history of a field through the people in it, well, the first person they're going to expect you to talk about is someone who either was the originator of the field or at least had substantial influence on the field in its very earliest days. Right? So as we work on answering the question of how this person helped the field to progress, make sure that this person had some significant impact on the original formation of the field. Otherwise, again, we're in that 30-second clock. We'll have a reader who's trying very hard to figure out what's happening and may or may not continue to go on, depending on how frustrated they feel. From there, figures 2 and 3, if applicable, well, the more pivotal these people are in the progression of the field, the better. Think of this essay, in fact, as building a very simple timeline through its selection of the figures that it includes. The better your essay can span the period from the origination of the field to the modern day, the more effective that essay is going to be. Lastly, I'd like to give you some things to remember as you go forward and begin the researching and eventually the drafting of this essay. First, make sure to keep track of your sources. This is a researched piece of writing. You'll need to make sure that you can cite important facts and include end citations. That's only possible if you're keeping careful track of the sources that you use. I know I've said the word relevant hopefully at least half a dozen times, but here's an excuse to say it again. Relevance is key. Like we said before, because we don't ever want your reader wondering why they're being told what they're being told. Everything's got to be relevant, and that relevance has to be at a very, very clear level. You've got to know that what you're reading fits in with everything else. Remember that you're talking about people primarily. Granted, we are choosing the people based on how they've had to do with a field of some kind, and that field is important, but we're primarily looking at the people as a way of telling the story of the field. In terms of citations, you'll need both in-text citations and at the end of the essay. This should be pretty old hat by now. Really, all of the writing we've done has been working on this exact skill. The essay will eventually become a speech that you record and post to YouTube for the rest of the class to watch. So I'd recommend keeping good notes. The better the notes are that you keep for this, the easier it's going to be for you to write the presentation that you'll eventually give. Lastly, ask yourself, am I being fair to the people that I'm profiling? Am I fairly covering his or her contributions? Would he or she, the person I'm profiling, approve of how he or she is treated in this essay? Overall, then, again, we're working on telling the story of your field through choosing 2 or 3 of the best, most important people who've helped that field to progress as far as it's come. As long as we're focusing on that main thing, tell the history of the field by choosing people who are really important to it, you'll certainly at least be on the right track.